Hey Techno Studs, in this video we're going to talk about router on a stick and demo how to configure that on Cisco equipment. Router on a stick is the idea that we have a router and then we have a single Ethernet cable going into that router plugged into the switch for all the VLANs that are connected to it. We do this by using sub-interfaces. So let's look at what does it look like to set up router on a stick. What I've already done is I've set up an Ethernet cable between our router and our switch. On the switch, I plugged it into FA1047. So that is the port that I'm plugged into there. On this router, I plugged it into FA01. All right, so now those are the interfaces that we are going to be configuring on each of those devices. And then what we'll do is we're going to set up this line to be 802.1q, which means it adds the tag for the VLAN information. So this switch right here, when it sends packet across this line, it's going to add the tag with the VLAN information. So then this router knows how to handle it. And then we'll set up IP addresses on this router right here using what we call sub-interfaces. So we have the interface FA01, and then we are going to have sub-interfaces to them, and we'll give them IDs. So VLAN 10 will have probably a VLAN or a sub-interface of 10, and then we'll give it an IP address. So that'll be 10.1.10.1 will be the address for it. So that's how we're going to set this up and configure this. Similar to my last video, I have my notes here on the top right. I have my network diagram. I've got a connection to S1, S2, and S3, even though we're just going to be configuring S1 and the router in this demo. And then I'm also pinging 10.1.10.21, which is my demo Pi 1. It's on the same network, same VLAN, so I've got connectivity there. And then I'm pinging 10.1.20.22. And you can see it's timing out because I don't have any routing between these networks at this point in time. So let's take a look at how to set up router on a stick to have this routing between these two devices. Now, in our last module, we set up trunk lines on our switches. And let's just take a look at how we configure that. So I'm going to do a show run interface FA1047. This is the interface that I said I've got connected into the router. I'm going to hit enter on that. I've got the correct description in there. The trunk native is VLAN 2. That's important. We will see that when we go to configure the router. And then trunks that are allowed, or VLANs that are allowed, is 2, 10, 20, 30, 40, 50, and 150. So those are going to be the VLANs we would want to configure on the switch. Now the purpose for this demo, we're just going to do VLAN 10 and 20, but we could go through and configure all of the VLANs this way so that all of the VLANs are routed through this same trunk line right here. Since switch 1 is already configured the way we want it, now it's time to go to the router and configure the router the way we want it. So let's jump over to the router. I've consoled into the router because at this point in time, I don't have connectivity into it. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to have to jump in here and enter my passwords in here from my password manager. So then I'm into this router and I'm going to do a show run interface FA, and we are looking at 0. 1 is the interface that we want to configure. So it's the IP address of something we've done quite a while ago in one of our past modules. So we're going to need to change this. So let's get into this. Let's get into the global configuration mode, get into interface FA01. We're into here. The description, headquarters, network link to HQS1, that's still valid, so that's still good. And then we have an IP address. We're going to take that IP address out of here, so let's remove that right there. And we're also going to remove this one right here. We don't want these messing up our configuration. So we'll take both of those out of there. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to get into what we had talked about, the sub interface. So let's get into a sub interface of this. So the first sub interface I'm going to do is VLAN 10. And so I'm going to get into, I'll do an up arrow to quickly get into here, and I'm going to create a sub interface. Now I'm configuring it for VLAN 10. So I could do the sub interface .1, and it's just the first sub interface. Or I could do a sub interface of 23. So I can specify whatever sub interface that I want. It's just a designator to keep it separate from everything else on every other sub interface on this interface. So it really doesn't matter what the ID is, the number I'm going to give this sub interface. But for consistency purposes, I always like it to match up with my VLAN. So in this case right here, I'm going to actually do sub interface 10. So 1.10 is going to be the sub interface. I'm going to hit enter on that. And now I'm into the sub interface. Look, you can see that it actually shows me that I'm in the sub interface right here. And I'm in the sub interface of FA0/110. All right. So I'm in here. Next, what I'm going to do is I'm going to configure it for being able to accept those, the tagging, the 802.1q tagging. The first thing that I'll do is put in a description into this. So I'm going to do a description, and then we'll just put VLAN 10 subinterface. We'll hit enter. And then next, I'm going to do an encapsulation .1q. Okay, that is the protocol, the definition of the protocol of that tagging and what the tagging looks like. So I'm going to do .1q and then the VLAN ID. So this is VLAN ID of 10. So now that number right there is important. It does need to line up with the VLAN tagging. So that is very specific. We need VLAN 10 there. So we hit enter, and now it can interpret that coming across there. And then we'll give this an IP address. So I'm going to give an IP address of 10.1.10.1. And then, of course, we've got to get a mask in there. Of course, we will want to also set up our VLAN 20 for this communication to happen. So what I'll do is I can get into the next sub interface. And once again, I always like the ID to match the VLAN. So .20 is what I'm going to choose. And I'm going to put in a description here, but instead of 10, we're going to have a description of 20. So I'll put in 20 here and hit enter. I want this .1q statement right here, but instead of 10, we're going to say VLAN 20. So there's that. And then we're going to get an IP address in here as well. And we will want to change the IP address to match that of something in VLAN 20. So now I have an IP address associated with VLAN 20 and is tagged with 20. And I have the same thing for 10 and is tagged with VLAN 10. The one other thing that I will mention is that we do have that VLAN 2, which is the native VLAN. So one other thing that I will show you is how to get into that interface. So we're going to create another sub-interface, but this sub-interface is just going to be 2. So it's going to be 01.2, so it matches up with that VLAN ID. We want the encapsulation. Well, let's do a description here first. So description, we'll call this native VLAN. And we'll hit enter. And then the .1q, we will specify that. But what we'll do is we'll include, it's going to be VLAN 2, and we'll include this word native in here. So native right there. And remember, that's going to be the stuff that's going to have untagged traffic to it. So I'm going to hit native and hit enter. And now that has a VLAN 2 is the untagged traffic because I just specified it right there. All right, so I'm going to exit out of here just in case. I'm going to do a no shutdown on the interface. Oh, do need to be into the interface though. FA, let's do 0, 1, and no shut on it. All right, I waited quite a while and it never came up. So I had to do some troubleshooting, which is just part of the process. There's quite often you'll find that things don't go quite as planned and you'll have to do some troubleshooting. So I used the show IP interface brief to take a look at my interfaces, make sure that they were up. I did the show run to take a look at those interfaces. I took a look at the IP route, which we haven't gone over really in this course yet, but to take a look at and see if the routing table looked correctly. And all in all, most everything looked fine, but something did catch my eye. I went to the switch 1 and looked at our interface. And here where it said operational mode, most of this was fine, but where it said operational mode, it said that it was an access port. And so that is what flagged that something is off. So I did this command, show interface FA1047 switch port, took a look at it. Once again, I saw operational mode said access. And so then I took a look at the running config. And I'll do a show run interface FA1047. And when I took a look at this interface, I didn't have this switch port mode trunk in there. So I entered the switch port mode trunk in which it gave me an error. I did some Googling and figured out I actually on the 3750, I needed to type in switch port trunk encapsulation.1q. So because of the type of switch I had a couple extra commands that I had to enter in. Well, this command should have been on there. I went over this in one of the prior videos. It's just that it didn't take on the 3750 and it was still able to communicate out to the other switches because DTP kicked in and everything worked out okay with communicating the other switches. But because this router probably doesn't have DTP set up on it and turned on and configured, or maybe it's not even possible on that, it didn't automatically create this trunk line between those two devices. And so I had to go and enter in a couple manual commands in here that was not a standard for this. But if I had one of my 2960s, we wouldn't have necessarily had this issue. So just keep that in mind. You have to do a little bit of troubleshooting to figure out some of these commands. And every switch is a little different in some of their ways that you can configure them. But you can see down here, I'm pinging both Demo Pi 1 and Demo Pi 2. So we are good to go. And now things are functioning correctly.